The controversial Button car plan. So at the start of the 1980s, Australia had a lot of car manufacturers producing lots of different models for the Australian market, with the five major local manufacturers being Ford Australia, who at the time were the best selling manufacturer in the country, followed by Holden, Toyota, Nissan and Mitsubishi. Mitsubishi had recently bought the Chrysler Australia factory in Tonsley Park in South Australia and was still producing the Chrysler Valiant there up until 1982, so you could argue that there were 6 brands being built there, even if they were by 5 manufacturers. At this time, Australia had a lot of protection for its automotive industry in the form of import tariffs, which were over 50%, which is very high. So as a result, foreign manufacturers would just produce their cars in Australian factories to avoid these. This also meant that the Australian-built cars could be changed to better suit the Australian conditions and for buyer preference. In the case of Holden and Ford, they built cars designed purely for the Australian market. So it was all good and well, except when John Button, the Federal Minister for Commerce, Trade and Industry at the time, thought that the industry was too big for such a small market and should be reduced so that manufacturers can focus more effort into a few cars rather than a whole range of models. This was also meant to improve the quality of the cars too, as he thought that the Australian cars of the era were not up to the standard of Japanese cars of the era. This is debatable considering some of the early 1980s Japanese cars I've dealt with. Anyway, enough of the politics and onto the cars. So to meet the criteria and cut the numbers down, brands formed partnerships and started to model share. This led to a lot of interesting rebadged cars. The first was the Holden Astra, which came out in 1984. It was a rebadged Nissan Pulsar N12. And I'm adding a few rec pictures in because this is a car wreck hunter. Ford also did some model sharing with Nissan, with the Ford Corsair UA, a rebadged Nissan Pintara U12. Now, when was the last time you saw one of these on the road? It had different lights, a different grille and different hubcaps when compared to the U12, but that was about it. Then there was the Ford Maverick, a rebadged Nissan Patrol GQ or Y60, but now with Maverick badges. Then there was the Nissan XFN Ute, which was a Ford Falcon XF Ute with a Nissan badge and Nissan hubcaps. The only other difference is that this one had a better warranty than the Ford, so it was said to be a better deal. Holden got in with Toyota too, and made cars like the Holden Nova, which was a Toyota Corolla AE90 with a Holden badge, and a different grille and lights too. This continued for a second generation with the AE100 Corolla based Nova. Also, Nova is Spanish for no go, making it the second worst car name due to its meaning in Spanish. You all know what the first one is. Then there was the Holden Apollo, a rebadged Camry SV20 with a Holden badge. This was followed by a second generation which was based on the wide-body XV10 Camry, which got its own front and rear end styling, and there was even an update in 1993 known as the JM, where they put a Commodore style split grille in. The last of all these was the Toyota Lexan, not to be confused with Lexus, a sub-brand of Toyota. This was a rebadged Holden Commodore with a Toyota front and rear end, and it lasted a few generations too, starting with the T1 Lexan, which was based off the VN Commodore. Then there was the T2 Lexan based off the VP Commodore, then the T3 based off the VR, the T4 and the T5 both based off the VS Commodore. Only the 6-cylinder models were built and only as sedans and wagons. So, did the Button car plan work? No, it was terrible. The Australian public was smart enough to realise that different brands were selling the same models, and the models by the original manufacturer outsold the rebadged ones 7-1. In some cases, like the Nissan XFN, probably even more. What it did do pretty well is damage the reputation of Ford and particularly Holden Not because Toyota or Nissan models were bad cars, but because these so-called Australian cars were selling Japanese cars, although technically Australian built ones, and marketing them under the Australian brands. Keep in mind this is before Japanese cars have the good reputation that they do today, as the 1990s is when they really improved. The other car I'd like to talk about in this is the Ford Laser. Now this is the reason I made this whole video, because I always thought that the Ford Laser was a product of the Budden car plan, and if it was the only successful thing to ever come out of it. But no, it was part of a deal between Ford and Mazda completely unrelated to the Budden car plan. Ford built the Laser in Australia and Mazda built the 323 in Japan, and they were sold side by side in Australia. The same is the case for the Ford Telstar and Mazda 626 and the Mazda 121 and Ford Festiva. So Nissan Australia did not survive the Budden car plan and shut up shop in 1994, but continued to sell imported cars. With almost no tariffs left by 2008, Mitsubishi Australia closed but continued to sell imported models as well. The last tariffs and assistance to the automotive industry was stopped in 2015. Keep in mind most countries do still have tariffs in place to support their local industries. And 1 year later, Ford Australia closed in 2016. The next year, Toyota and shortly after Holden also closed, marking the end of all Australian car manufacturing. Holden continued to sell imported cars up until 2020, but no one wanted an import Holden because the whole idea of a Holden as a brand was Australian built cars designed for Australian conditions. So Holden was closed by GM in 2020 without even an attempt to sell it to another brand. Most of Holden's production machinery was shipped to SAIC in China, the company that owns MG and LDV. So the Budden car plan didn't help the Australian car industry. If anything, it played a pretty decent part in killing it. Hope you enjoyed this video, which is slightly different to the usual. The idea of this came while making the Ford Laser history video. So, look forward to that.